Hi, my name is Julia Felice. As Jessica said, I was here for a short stint last year.
Oh, excuse me.
My slides will be up in a moment. So what I did at TCI was to look at how adequate the Indian national food supply is to actually meet the per capita nutrient needs of its population. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of that work I did. And I will forewarn you that I did this work a year ago, so some of the details might be a little bit foggy, but I might recall them if you prompt me. So I'm just going to give you very, very brief background here, the stuff that you won't already know. There are some recent data that indicate that the dietary intake of Indians is improving. Namely, they're consuming more energy and more protein per capita. And this is great for reducing hunger and its consequences. However, India has been far behind its expectations and goals for reducing malnutrition. So the question is why? If people are eating more, why isn't malnutrition going down more quickly? Micronutrient deficiencies and a high risk of them are both highly prevalent in India, and micronutrients have a wide range of critical functions, which means deficiencies bring a range of health risks. You have earlier birth of smaller infants who are thus less able to breastfeed, setting them up for risks to their health, growth, and development in the short and long term. Diminished maternal capacities, increased risk of illness and infection, suboptimal cognitive development of infants, and diminished height and weight attained versus the potential height and weight obtained. So we care about these outcomes because many of them are used as proxies for assessing prevalence of malnutrition. So I had some pretty straightforward research aims for this project. First, I wanted to assess the quantity of macronutrients, energy, protein, and fat, and of micronutrients, specifically iron, zinc, and vitamin A in India's national food supply. And I wanted to calculate the sufficiency of these macronutrients and micronutrients to meet India's national population needs. And last, I wanted to calculate the contribution of a range of food groups to the supply of micronutrients. So I'll talk you through some general methods I used here. I started by assessing the micronutrient content of plant foods and animal foods per 100 grams. In other words, how nutritious is the food available to Indians? Using food balance sheets from the Food and Agriculture Organization, we know how many metric tons of each food were produced, therefore how much food. And together, we have a Mac PC formatting snafu here. Together, this tells us the total amount of iron, zinc, and vitamin A in the food supply. Add that with demographic population and age data, age and sex data, and we can have a demographically weighted supply of iron, zinc, and vitamin A per capita per day. If we look at the Indian nutrition recommendations, what do people need per capita, and combine it with that demographic data, we can assess the demographically weighted need for iron, zinc, and vitamin A per capita per day. Treating these as a ratio of supply to demand, we have a demographically weighted sufficiency of these micronutrients as a percent. So this was the major impetus for the project, was new information available in the micronutrient content of foods. And that specifically came from this book, The Nutritive Value of Indian Foods. This was extensive and India-specific nutrient data on the plant and animal-based foods. But because of there are incomplete data in this book as far as the list of foods they have included and the nutritional data, I supplemented these data with the Bangladesh food composition tables and the USDA nutrient database. This gave us a comprehensive view of how nutritious each of these foods were. So looking at these graphs, I'm going to show you a series of graphs showing the sufficiency of nutrients over time. This gray bar represents 100%. In other words, if we had exactly enough to meet everybody's needs per capita per day, we would hit 100%. And we're looking from 1990 to 2011 here, so this is roughly over 20 years. We have more than enough energy per capita than we need in the food supply, more than enough protein, but not enough fat. So this aligns with what we saw before about the increases in protein and energy being consumed. Now let's look at micronutrients. Iron is actually about or just under what we need per capita per day. This doesn't take into account a number of factors, which I'll mention in a minute. Zinc, we have about exactly enough as much as what we need, but not nearly enough vitamin A per capita per day. I also included this line to show iron from animal sources because this iron in its heme form is much more highly absorbable, and I thought that might be of interest. The next question was, how much does each food group in the food balance sheets contribute to the total availability of these micronutrients? First, looking at iron. Do I have a? That's not going to work. Okay. So you can see a key on the side here of what each color block represents, and you can see that by far the largest contributor to iron in the food supply is cereals. And in fact, the changes in the amount of cereals produced are driving a lot of the changes in iron in the food supply. We also have a fair amount coming from vegetables and from pulses. But you will notice that with the exception of animal foods, which is the red bar down at the bottom, the vast majority of iron available in the food supply is non-heme iron, which is subject to coabsorption or malabsorption as a result of the presence of other nutrients. So for example, vitamin C would increase absorption, while the presence of some other nutrients would decrease absorption. This also doesn't take into account the iron status of a population and how it may impact their iron absorption. You see a very similar picture for zinc. The major driver of zinc in the food supply is cereals. And vitamin A. This looks rather different from the two minerals pictures. We've got two major contributors, both animal foods and vegetables. But there's almost no contribution of cereals. I also wanted to compare then versus now. How has the food supply changed? This first set of bars compares iron content between 1990 and 2011. And you can see that the changes are small increases across each group. There isn't one food group that's really dominating this change. In zinc, we have growth in animal foods across the board here. And last, for vitamin A, the major driver and increase in vitamin A in the food supply is animal-based foods. Iron has small increases overall, and spices actually contributed to that, which was surprising. Zinc, huge increase in animal foods, vegetables, and roots. And vitamin A also increases in animal foods. There are a number of limitations from these data. As I said, there were limitations of foods available in the Nutritive Value of Indian Foods book. There were limitations of the nutrient data that were available in there. And so where we had to fill in data from Bangladesh and from the US. So how appropriate these data were is in question. But this is the most comprehensive nutrient database that we have yet. So what TCI now has is a comprehensive database of all the foods that are listed in this book, supplemented with nutrient data from data sets around the world. And they can use this to answer a number of future research questions. What we can conclude, despite the limitations of these data, there is likely enough energy and protein in the Indian national food supply to meet everyone's needs. And this is supported by available intake data, so we can feel pretty reasonably certain about this conclusion. But there is not enough fat available to meet per capita needs. This is of concern because fat deposition is critical during pregnancy and lactation for both the short and long-term health of the mother and the baby. And fat intake is particularly important to infant and young child growth and development. It's also of concern on a population basis because fat intake is important to the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamins A, E, and K. You can see how this might compound the issue of not enough vitamin A in the food supply if there also isn't enough fat. We can also see that an increasing proportion of available micronutrients are coming from animal source foods. And if the data we used are reasonably accurate, there were various methods that I used to cross-check these, but you don't want to hear those details today. There may be enough iron and zinc in the food supply to meet everyone's needs before absorption is taken into account, but even then it's close. And there's likely not enough vitamin A in the food supply, and the absorption is accounted for in that calculation. So there are a number of steps that we could take forward with this work that TCI could have a hand in. We could characterize the absorbable versus available quantity of micronutrients in the Indian food supply. We could connect the data that I just presented to you to dietary intake data. If we have enough of iron and zinc, but certain population groups aren't getting enough, it would be helpful to know how these nutrients are distributed equitably or inequitably in actual intake data. And we could further connect this trail to health outcomes that are going to result from these micronutrient statuses. So I want to say thank you to TCI for the warm welcome and the support and the learning opportunity. And thank you for letting me come here and talk about this today.